everyone. Welcome back to English Conversation Studio. I'm Anna, and today we are going to talk about one of the biggest struggles that almost every English learner experiences. Because many people spend hours memorizing vocabulary lists, writing words repeatedly, and studying translations every day. But after a short time, they suddenly realize that they forgot most of the words they worked so hard to learn.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex, and today we will discuss why learners forget vocabulary so quickly, why traditional memorization methods often fail, and how you can train your brain to remember English words naturally for a much longer time through repetition, emotional connection, context, speaking practice, and real-life usage instead of simple mechanical memorization.
One of the biggest mistakes learners make is trying to memorize isolated words without context. Because when the brain sees vocabulary as random, disconnected information, it does not understand why the word is important. So after a short period of time, the memory becomes weak and the word slowly disappears from active recall.
Yes, and this is why learners often recognize a word when reading or listening, but completely forget it during speaking, because the vocabulary never became part of an active communication system inside the brain. It only existed temporarily as passive memorized information without emotional or practical connection.
Another major problem is learning too many words at the same time, because many learners become excited and try to study 50 or even 100 new words in a single day, but the brain becomes overloaded very quickly, and instead of remembering everything successfully, it remembers almost nothing clearly after a few days.
Exactly, because the brain needs repetition, emotional connection, and gradual exposure in order to transfer vocabulary into long-term memory. And learners who focus on a smaller number of useful words usually remember them much better than learners who constantly chase huge vocabulary lists without active practice or repetition.
One of the most effective techniques is learning vocabulary through full sentences instead of individual words, because sentences create meaning, emotion, context, and natural structure, which helps the brain understand how the word is actually used during real communication situations.
Yes, for example, instead of memorizing only the word exhausted, it is much more powerful to learn a sentence like, I was exhausted after working all day, because now the brain connects the word with emotion, action, and a realistic human situation instead of storing it as isolated information.
Another important method is visualization, because the human brain remembers pictures and emotions much more strongly than abstract information. So when you learn a word, you should immediately imagine a real image, situation, or personal memory connected to that vocabulary item.
Exactly. For example, if you learn the word beach, you can imagine the ocean, the sound of waves, warm sunlight, sand, and maybe even a personal vacation memory. And these mental images create stronger memory pathways that make vocabulary easier to remember naturally.
Emotional connection is also extremely powerful for memory, because words connected to strong feelings usually stay longer in the brain. So learners remember vocabulary much more effectively when they use personal stories, experiences, goals, dreams, or emotional situations during practice.
Yes, for example, if somebody learns the phrase, I was nervous before my interview, and they connect it with a real emotional experience from their own life, the phrase becomes meaningful and memorable instead of just another random grammar example from a textbook.
Another reason learners forget vocabulary is lack of active usage, because many people only read or listen passively, but they rarely speak, write, or create sentences using the words they study. So the brain decides the vocabulary is not important enough to keep in long-term memory.
Exactly. The brain prioritizes information that gets used repeatedly. So if you actively speak, write, repeat aloud, and use vocabulary during conversations, your brain understands that these words are necessary tools for communication and stores them much stronger over time.
Repetition is also extremely important because learning a word once is almost never enough for long-term memory, and learners who review vocabulary regularly through spaced repetition usually remember words much longer than learners who constantly study new information without reviewing old material consistently. Yes, and repetition works best when it happens naturally over time, because seeing, hearing, speaking, and reading the same word again and again in different contexts helps the brain strengthen memory connections gradually until the vocabulary becomes automatic and easy to recall during communication. Another very effective strategy is grouping vocabulary into categories, because the brain remembers organized information more easily than random information. So learning words connected to food, travel, emotions, work, or daily routines can help create stronger logical memory connections. Exactly. When words belong to the same category, the brain creates a mental network between them. So remembering one word often helps trigger memory for related vocabulary naturally during conversations and speaking situations. I also think learners should spend more time listening to natural English repeatedly, because hearing vocabulary used naturally in conversations, podcasts, videos, and stories helps the brain understand pronunciation, rhythm, emotional tone, and realistic usage patterns much better than simple translation memorization. Yes, repeated exposure through listening is extremely powerful because the brain slowly absorbs vocabulary subconsciously over time, and learners who regularly listen to understandable English often remember words naturally without even realizing how many expressions they have learned. Another important thing is patience, because many learners expect instant results, and when they forget a word one or two times, they immediately feel discouraged. But forgetting is actually a normal part of the learning process, and memory becomes stronger every time you review and reuse the vocabulary again. Exactly. Language learning is not about perfect memory from the beginning. It is about gradually strengthening neural connections through consistent practice, repetition, communication, and emotional engagement until vocabulary becomes automatic and permanently available during speaking and thinking. Many learners also improve when they start thinking in English using new vocabulary immediately after learning it, because creating internal English thoughts forces the brain to use vocabulary actively instead of only recognizing it passively during reading or listening exercises. Yes, for example, after learning new words related to weather, emotions, or routines, you can describe your day mentally in English, and this kind of active mental practice strengthens vocabulary memory much more effectively than silent memorization alone. So today we discussed why learners forget vocabulary, why passive memorization often fails, and how techniques like context learning, visualization, emotional connection, repetition, active speaking, listening practice, and category grouping can help you remember English vocabulary naturally for a much longer time. Yes, and if you consistently use these methods every day, your vocabulary memory will become much stronger, your speaking confidence will improve, and English words will start appearing naturally in your mind during conversations without constant stress or forgetting. If you enjoyed this lesson, please don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends, because practicing together makes learning easier, more motivating, and much more enjoyable. And subscribe to English Conversation Studio for more vocabulary lessons, fluency training, and natural English speaking practice every week. Thank you very much for listening and practicing with us today. See you in the next lesson, and keep building your English vocabulary every single day.